Centre, thanks, in Sault Ste. Marie in Ontario. And I understand that in addition to the local content, this center also has some Arctic materials. So Krista, I'll get you to introduce yourself to make sure we've got the pronunciation correct, and then have you talk a little bit about your center, and then tell us about the work that you've been doing. So please go ahead, Krista.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to check. Can I share my screen so I can actually share a couple like images and stuff as we go along?
Yeah, you should be able to now, I think. Give it a
Okay.
go and see.
Just give me 1 second to
No
make sure I get
problem.
the right tab situation going on. Okay. Okay. I'm assuming everybody can see that.
Perfect.
Great. So it's nice to meet everyone. So I am Krista McCracken. I'm the researcher and curator at the Shingwauk Residential Schools Centre. We're housed by Algoma University, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the center because I really think it's important to understand kind of the community context of its space because it guides a lot of our archival work. Um, so given that, I'm going to talk about kind of place because much of the work of the Shingwauk Residential School Center is rooted in its geographic location in Wawanosh, which is now known as Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. So the slide shows a couple different iterations of the Shingwauk Residential School. The first Shingwauk School opened on this site in 1874. And the second building, which is the color photograph, it opened in 1935 and operated as a residential school until 1970. And so students from as far south as like Walpole Island and as far north as the James Bay coast came to Shingwauk, with over 85 First Nation communities being impacted by the school. The school closed in 1970, as I mentioned, and in 1971, Algoma University moved onto the Shingwauk site and still operates in that space today. I would say when the university first moved into the space, if you had have spoken to somebody and asked kind of like, oh, what was this building before it was a resident or before it was a university? No one would have come out and said it was a residential school. There was a lot of institutional forgetting going on and just a lot of lack of awareness. It really was the survivor community who recognized the importance of the Shingwauk site and really worked to make sure that this history wasn't forgotten. The photograph on the slide is of the 1981 Shingwauk reunion. This was the first residential school reunion to be held at the Shingwauk site. And really, when they were organizing the event, they didn't really know who would want to come back to a former residential school. But over the course of the weekend, they had over 300 survivors participate in events. Um, and that gathering itself, I think, is really significant, particularly if you think about the fact that it happened in the 1980s when residential schools were still open in Canada, and there really wasn't a national conversation going on around the harms of the system. The reunion resulted in the founding of the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association, an organization dedicated to advocating for survivor rights and preserving the history of residential schools. Additionally, part of what happened at that first reunion is people showed up and wanted to have their experiences recorded and to make sure that the history of the Shingwauk site was preserved. People also showed up with photographs and documents and wanting a way to share that material with other survivors. And this collecting of material was really the beginning of the archive component of the Shingwauk Residential School Centre. And one of the main reasons that survivors wanted to start their own community archive is because they wanted a say in how their history was being told, and they wanted their voices and their experience centered in how it was preserved and taught to future generations. So today, the archive portion of the work of the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association is really housed in the Shingwauk Residential Schools Centre. For many years, it really was operated as a grassroots community-based archive. They had a small space on campus, but was operated solely by volunteers of survivors. Um, Today, the center operates under a formal memorandum of understanding between the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association and the Algoma University. There's also an ongoing construction project known as McCracken, which will be the new physical home of the Shingwauk Residential Schools Centre. And this new space is going to be purpose-built space for the archives, including things like culturally appropriate storage and dedicated space for the survivor organization. The initial scope of the Shingwauk Residential Schools Centre when it was established in 1981 was fairly limited to materials connected to the Shingwauk Residential School. However, since the late 90s, the mandate has really expanded to include materials from other residential schools, survivor groups, and healing initiatives across Canada. Today, the center holds materials relating to residential schools in Canada and the United States, and it is also the repository for the library and archives of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the specific Arctic and Northern materials held by the center. The first one being the Secord collection. So he was a doctor from Sault Ste. Marie who worked in the Arctic from 1953 to 1955. This collection includes photographs of community members, community activities, some newspapers, maps, and weather charts. Most of the photographs include non-identified Indigenous peoples. Some of the photographs do have associated geographic places, but others do not even have that information associated with them. The other collection that kind of comes to mind is the Mildred Young Hubert collection. So it includes residential school photographs from Whitehorse and Yellowknife. This is a relatively new collection to the Shingwauk Residential Schools Centre. It came to us because it also contains a relatively large selection of photographs of Shingwauk itself. The collection was actually previously split between the Yukon Archives and the Archives of Ontario, and both institutions have transferred the records to the Shingwauk Residential Schools Centre in the last few years. We physically process the materials and describe them online, but are currently in the process of going through some digitization efforts and really thinking about how we're going to describe the images in more detail before making them accessible to community. The Grey Nuns collection of Montreal is kind of the next one I would like to touch on. We received this one kind of around the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And essentially, the Grey Nuns of Montreal were going through their holdings, and anything they had duplicates of got sent to the Shingwauk Residential Schools Centre. In many cases, this was publications that were created at residential schools. So including content from places like Grolier Hall in the Northwest Territories, Fort Resolution School. We have a number of student newspapers that were produced from that residential school. We also have a fairly complete run of the publication known as the Indian Record or the Indian Missionary Record, which really covered Oblate missionary work with Indigenous peoples in Canada. And it includes articles and photographs about Northern residential schools and other missionary work in the North. Lastly, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation collection Includes both library and archival materials with a Inuit focus, as well as raw research data that was undertaken in some of the research projects that the Aboriginal Healing Foundation undertook in the North during its operation. So kind of thinking about some of the approaches that the Shingwauk Residential Schools Centre has taken to date. A lot of our metadata work that's really focused on decolonization has started with an emphasis on the records pertaining to the Shingwauk Residential School and the residential schools that were located in Spanish Ontario. And this has really been our focus because of the significant survivor involvement and just the emphasis of community that exists within the center. I think one of the examples of that is really the Remember the Children project. It's one of the longest running programs offered by the center. And it is really, it's kind of like a photo identification project. And it began in 2004 and was initially focused on the residential schools from Spanish Ontario. So the center had a collection of about 5,000 images from the Spanish schools. And in many cases, these students weren't identified in those images. So I would say one thing that is somewhat unique about the photographs from Spanish is that there was a photography lab on site. And so some of the photos were actually taken by students of other students. And so there's a fairly unique perspective in those photos that you don't see in many other residential school photography. But as part of the initial pilot project in 2004, members of the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association really, they got in their cars and they just started visiting community and working with survivors in those communities. That project had about a 40% identification rate of people in the photographs. And at the end of the project, the center helped create reproduction photo albums of all the photos related to the Spanish residential schools. And they were created thematically. So for example, there was a sports photo, a boys photo album, and a girls photo album. But at the conclusion of the project, those reproduction photo albums were left in community centers, libraries, wellness centers, and band offices. And kind of throughout the initiative, if anybody saw a photograph of themselves or a relative or even just someone they knew, we were happy to provide copies of those images free of charge. And I think one of the reasons why I think mentioning the Remember the Children project is so important in this context is that it kind of is really exemplifying the community-based description practices that have really been in place at the Shingwauk Residential School Centre for many years. And the emphasis on trying to integrate the survivor experience into the archival record. We've also looked at different forms of reparative description, particularly around how things like collections are named, as well as file level description of photographs, particularly if they're using a provided caption, and it might include racist, dated, or offensive language. So doing work around language statements, as well as thinking through what documenting that existing language looks like, and including new language does as well. We also recently moved to a new database system for us. And one of those things that we were able to do with that move was the integration of local context traditional knowledge labels. And we use those really to supplement our access and use notes field on the font and series level. In particular, we found the permissions labels pretty helpful in terms of including or indicating which materials are appropriate to use. And we're also looking at the introduction of provenance labels into our records. Likewise, we do have an ongoing project around place names. And this is really around updating the names of First Nation communities, Indigenous communities in our place names taxonomy so that they don't only have an English language name, they have a Indigenous language name if that is known, and really making sure that the contemporary community name is included, not just the English language name that was potentially imposed through colonial processes. I would say that's very much a work in progress at this point. We started with updating names of the 85 First Nation communities that were connected through the Shingwauk Residential School and are kind of working on expanding outwards. So from my perspective, I think there are, some challenges as there are, I think, with a lot of this kind of work. For us, we're really heavily reliant on the input and guidance of the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association. And I'd say when it comes to our Arctic materials in particular, that's not our typical area of focus. So in terms of like capacity and resourcing, there's definitely a bit of a gap there. Likewise, we are a fairly small shop. There's myself, who I'm the researcher and curator, though fundamentally my job is as an archivist. We have a digital archives technician, my colleague Jenna LeMay, and then my colleague Serena Hill does our outreach and community-based work as well as our educational programming, but we're really just a team of 3 at this point. I would say I've been at the center since 2010, and that staffing level has gone up and down throughout the times, mostly through grant-based funding. But yeah, that capacity is definitely a very real thing when doing this work. Likewise, I think in terms of, staff and community expertise, Bawating is very much a community that there's a diverse range of Indigenous folks who live in that area. However, one of our strengths is really, for example, Anishinaabe-Moan, because the university offers one of the only Anishinaabe-Moan language programs in Canada. So when we're going outside of that language group, definitely looking at other resources and communities for expertise. And just as someone who has been doing this work for a little while, I think I'm always trying to think about sustainability, particularly in an era when things like budgets are shrinking and we're being asked to do more with less. So those are just kind of some of the ongoing challenges. I do think this work is definitely still worth prioritizing and doing. It's just a matter of how long it takes sometimes, and that's totally okay. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy if there's questions or anything like that to chat.
I have many questions, but I'll ask if other folks have questions for Krista.
If I could jump in, I wouldn't mind. Thanks so much, Krista, for that presentation. Really interesting. And I like Sandy, I have many questions as well, but I was interested in the collection you noted, the Northern collection that comes from a physician who took photographs and things, as we have, numerous collections, similar collections here at the University of Alberta. And at some point in the past, some of these were digitized by in various projects by other organizations at the university or by, the researchers who deposited them. And so this isn't necessarily focused strictly on descriptive aspects, but just thinking about those collections and the digitization of those. And I just wondered, when you're doing your digitization, are those digitized, but then sort of still kind of maybe protected in a way so that maybe for community members who maybe come or have access to some sort of platform, or are they openly available? And how have you been sort of navigating that around some of these collections where maybe you have, physicians who are out working with communities, but, their roles are very kind of complex and the way they work with communities sort of complex, and how kind of the ethical aspects of that. I don't know if you have any thoughts, and I'd love to hear, kind of how you're approaching that. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the collections that I've really struggled with as an archivist because I think it is so complex. When the collection was first accepted by the center, it was digitized in its entirety, and parts of it were made available online, particularly things that didn't actually include people in it. As of right now, it's kind of labeled as for community use. And if someone from one of the communities that, we do have geographic information about, does, approach us, we are happy to provide access. However, I think because of the complexity of us actually not knowing a lot about how these photos were taken or in what type of relationship the physician was in, we're not comfortable making the entire collection public at this point, and that's kind of where it's at present moment.
Great, wonderful. Thank you.
Cecily, you had a question?
Yes, thank you for the lovely presentation. It was so interesting to hear. I work in Denmark with a collection that concerns Inuit in Greenland. And I would like to ask about the community. I don't know, what did you call it? Like a community, you collected metadata through a community effort or something?
Like some community-based description. Yeah.
Exactly. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
And it sounded like it was through the Alumni Association. Is that correct?
Yes, it was. And actually, I think from my perspective, that's why that particular initiative was really so successful, is because in many cases, it was survivors of the residential school system talking to other survivors, and or people who already had perhaps a community relationship in some way. And so that there was that kind of built-in support.
But I would love to actually, if I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to hear how it was possible to mine this information. Was it physical meetings? Was it like a newsletter they could answer? Because we have a photo collection where people from Greenland write on the photos, but it's very public, so we can't put all the photos there. And some of them would be quite interesting to reach out to communities to hear more about.
Yeah, so it was very much because it was almost 20 years ago at the point that this project started. It was very much a physical medium project in that the center itself, printed off reproduction photos and brought those into community. And basically, people would just sit down, and if they recognize someone, write directly on that reproduction photo. And then I would say it was a number of years before that information ever got transferred back to the archival record. It stood kind of as a standalone project that was really to serve community in terms of providing access to those photos.
Yeah.
However, the backtracking and connecting those photos to the archival record didn't happen for probably about a decade after that initial project started.
Yeah, but that's wonderful to hear, because I think that's some of the things we're actually considering doing with some of the more sensitive materials, asking people to meet somewhere comfortable for them, and then looking at the photos. So that's really interesting, because we have only done it online, because Greenland is far away, but a lot of Greenlanders live in Denmark. So that's very, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Were there other questions? Sharon, I know you had other questions. You go ahead, please.
Oh, no, you go ahead, Sandy. I want to make sure you have a chance to ask. You go ahead.
One of the questions that I had was whether or not there are other centers like the one you have in the country? Like if there are other sort of residential school centers doing the same kind of thing that you're doing?
I would think to some extent the Woodland Cultural Center that's connected to the Mohawk Institute in Ontario does some similar work. Likewise, UBC's Indian History and Residential School Dialogue Center does work with communities in British Columbia, and has done some community engagement that is very similar. And like relating to residential schools, probably like the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation definitely does have one of the larger residential school holdings. I would say their approach to how they work with community is very different than ours, though.
So does that National Center have big photo collections as well? Do you know?
They do, particularly because of how they collected records from all of the religious archives in Canada. There's a vast number of photographs, though they are more of a post-custodial archive in that they have digital copies of most things, not physical.
Right. And what was the name again of the Mohawk one?
The Woodland Cultural Center.
Right. Sharon, if you have other questions, please go ahead.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I would just really happy to hear about the work around the with the TK labels. And I'm just wondering, you said you've got a new system that you're using, and you're able to start exploring the incorporation of those TK labels. So I'm just curious to know what platform you're using.
Yeah, so we recently moved to a collective access database.
Okay, and they have integration with the.
They do,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
They were actually really great to work with in that, in addition to their standard kind of database layout, we do have like a module on the website that's also very place-based, so that you can actually navigate the archival collections through a map as well. And so that was another one that I think was really helpful.
That's great. Yeah, thank you very much.
David, thanks for that note about the US-based archive. Um, uh, is that U Minnesota, UMN?
Believe so. Yeah, I think that's where the hosting
Right.
is.
Yeah. Okay, we'll have a look at that one as well. So one of my other questions was about the permission labels that you have there. That was one of your um, sort of different labeling, and I'm wondering sort of what kind of structure that has, and if that's a standard sort of thing.
Yeah, so it's actually created under the Local Contexts project, and they have a standardized, like internationally used system of labels. And so we're using their labels primarily, though I would say they come with standard kind of descriptive text that goes with them. But how we have our database set up is it automatically imports that standardized text, but we do have the option to tweak it to particular collections in the event that there's something specific we need to mention.
And so when you're applying those, and there might be that tweak happening, is there a part of that process where a local person or a local committee or someone would look at it and decide that no, that description doesn't quite fit in this case?
So yeah, I think that's actually a really good question. And in our case, because we added these new labels when we moved databases, it was a pretty lengthy process, but we actually went through the existing access and use statements for each collection, and that's how we picked which label we were going to use. And those previous access and use statements were generally created by the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association or the impacted community represented in those records.
Right.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
How big is the Alumni Association?
Yeah. So I would say it has a core group that like is part of the executive and regular kind of function of the alumni association that's maybe about 20 people. However, they do hold annual events that's multiple hundred members at this point.
Wow. It's wonderful.
Today, like I have worked at the center for about 16 years at this point. And when I first started, that organization was much more solely survivors. Today, it is a mixture of survivors and intergenerational survivors, just the nature of how the organization has changed as, you know, the group has evolved and folks have passed on, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. Is it is the group mostly from special years, if you can say that, like?
I would say currently a lot of folks who are part of the group were there in like the 1950s and the 1960s. Just kind of, again, the nature of folks who attended Shingwauk earlier aren't typically alive right now. But geographically, there's a very wide range of folks because, as I mentioned, like 85 First Nation communities were impacted by Shingwauk. So many of the members aren't actually from Sault Ste. Marie or don't currently live in Sault Ste. Marie.
Okay, thank you.
Sharon, did you have other questions or anyone else? If not, I have several more. You mentioned early on, you mentioned culturally appropriate storage, and I'm wondering what that means.
So a couple different things. It's not finished being built yet, but the idea anyways, is that it's actually going to be a room that is lined in cedar, which is a sacred medicine in the area that I live in. It's also going to be a space where people can smudge in without setting off, you know, the fire alarms and things like that in the space. And we do have some items that have cultural significance in our collections. And so they would be stored in that space actually permanently, just in terms of care.
Excellent. So it's kind of, it's more culturally appropriate space. That I was imagining somehow documents or pictures being stored in a culturally appropriate way.
So there are a couple examples in our collection where we do actually store like tobacco with materials specifically. So like that's one example of culturally appropriate storage.
Rachel has a question. Thank you. Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, so my connection's bad. I wondered if you had any direct cooperation with the TRC archives in Manitoba at the TRC Centre.
Yeah, I would say our interactions with them have kind of varied over the years. One of the other kind of hats I wear at my job is Algoma University is also the repository for the Anglican Diocese of Algoma. And so in that capacity, we've worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to make sure that they have copies of materials that are held in the diocesan archives. We've also worked with them on things like the National Register connected to unmarked burial, or not unmarked burials, but missing and murdered like children from residential schools, in correcting the names related to Shingwauk. And have generally kind of tried to work to share resources specific to the Shingwauk site. Yeah.
Thank you. I have another question about the archives that comes from the Yukon. And this was a split archives. You said part of it existing in Ontario and part of it in the Yukon.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that came to be. One of the issues that concerns me is materials from northern centers being stored in southern sites where they're remote from the community that they came from. And so I'm wondering how that came about, that a Yukon collection, I think it was Fort Resolution as well, ended up in Southern Ontario.
Yeah, and so that particular one, I do think it was because there was a substantial amount of Shingwauk content in that collection as well that the decision was made. However, the Yukon actually received that collection as like a bequest that they didn't ask for, essentially. And so the material was never formally accessioned. Um, yeah.
Yeah. So then the follow-up to that would be, how would you, when you're attempting to manage that collection, how would you get the community and cultural connection to that collection at your site? Like, do you have anything in place to be able to talk to those people at Fort Resolution?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good question. And I think it's one we're still trying to kind of parse through ourselves. And I think partially because the collection is entirely slides. And so just in terms of like actually knowing what's in it yet, we're still in the process of figuring that out. Yeah.
Right. And sorry, does anybody else have any questions? I feel like I'm monopolizing the airwaves here.
I have a question, a follow-up to what you just asked, if I could.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks, Krista. It was a great presentation. I'm full disclaimer, I'm the archivist at the Inuit Circumpolar Council.
Okay.
So I was just wondering how the Inuit specific material made it to the center.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think it's really because it was residential school focused.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at just what exists in the landscape in terms of residential school archives, the Shingwauk Center is one of the few that's actually run by community and is really prioritizing community access. So I think, to be honest, that's why it ended up there.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
I just have a note that Algoma is not the only one. The
No.
Labrador campus, which is Memorial University's Labrador campus, the building that we used to occupy as the Labrador Institute was the former boarding school in Northwest River. So that has implications that are far reaching. And the archives that I inherited that are now closed include, like you said, there's medical photos, there's so yeah, there's a lot of barriers to build bridges, even to know how to interact with community members, knowing that what we have is harmful. We were for 40 years in a space that was a boarding school, and then mixed with the other aspect of Newfoundland and Labrador that the Confederation timeline has impacted the TRC. So actually the boarding schools, which would be residential schools, survivors had to fight to even be included. So we're still kind of picking through that. So I might follow up with you a bit more about ways of opening up the conversation, because I'm parsing through a lot of barriers right now. And because our archives are closed, our disclosure statement on our campus landing page, so this doesn't have anything to do with the other Memorial University campuses, but ours specifically are closed. But if a community member is asking for information about themselves or their community, it's wide open. But I think we're looking for ways. Also, there's no capacity. I'm the only person here, so I don't have anybody else at all. But there is an Indigenous archivist who does work with me, and it's just the capacity part. When I hear your story, at least that validates why we are where we are, because you don't want to go full steam ahead and cause harm or set up something that can't be sustained. So I'm going to be following up with you on just anything that can maybe help us start connecting people with their archives, regardless of description, just to even know that it exists.
Yeah, totally happy to have a follow-up.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I have lots of other questions, but right now it's getting harder to articulate them. So one of the things, sorry, I should just poll again. And are there any other questions at all? So before we sign off, I want to thank you, Krista, for your presentation. This has been really good, really interesting, and I think has given us lots of different things to think about, and also creates more of the community among us to understand, where everybody's working, and to see that everybody has similar kinds of questions and problems. So thanks so much for your presentation. Before we sign off, I want to introduce Valentine Ribideau-Dumas, who is going to be our presenter next month. Valentine, do you just want to introduce yourself here a little bit?
Yes, hi. Thanks for welcoming me. It was very interesting. Thank you so much, Krista. And it's exactly what you said. I realized we're having all the same, at least on our side, we're having the same issues on many subjects, and that's very interesting to hear about it. I work as a research associate at Laval University in Quebec City, where Suzanne is apparently. And we just ended with the library actually of Université Laval a project called Inuit Worlds, on a collection of ethnographic objects that were mainly from Igloolik in Nunavut, and we're going to launch in a couple weeks a website that's an educational tool for young Inuit as well as for scientists and the general public that we have built with the community and with partners there. So, and also we're working on another ethnographic fund now, trying to connect this funding with the Inuit and make sure we start at the right step before even archiving anything. So that's probably what I'm going to present next time. So thanks for having me. It's very interesting.
Thanks, Valentine. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that Sarah and I have been working with Sharon Rankin, who was not able to be here today because the ice storm took out her power for 2 days, and she's trying to sort all of that. But we're working on a grant proposal to try to build a better network. This would be one of the UArctic grants. A better network to identify where collections are, where they exist. And it seems to me that we've got a list of 4 or 5 just out of today's session of collections that I certainly didn't know about. There is a large directory that's of Arctic collections that lives on the Scott Polar Research Institute page, but hasn't been updated for a long time. And I think that what we're going to be working on first would just be Canadian collections. But it sounds to me like we could even have a listing of just where the Inuit photo collections are, because Annie, I think there are some at the National Archives, are there not?
Yes, we do have a project naming. I think that's the title, and it's a collection of photos that we have here at Library and Archives Canada of Inuit people, and we have really built strong connections with the communities, and people can name the people they recognize on the pictures. So it's a long-term, it's been a couple of years now that we are doing this project.
Right. So I think, whether or not we get grant funding, I think we will try to start working on collating some of this information so that people can find out where these collections are. And, not just library and archives types, but also communities, because there are probably people who are connected, for example, to Shingwauk, who might not be any longer in that community, but may, want to find out where that material exists. So anyway, I think this has been a really excellent and interesting session. And if no one has any other questions, I think we will end it here. Are there any other questions or comments at this point? If not, thanks again, Krista. That was really excellent. And we'll all look forward to Valentine's session, which I believe is April 15th. It'll be that third Wednesday in April. So thanks so much, everyone.
Merci.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Farvel.